Okay, so on behalf of all of our partner organizations, and they're listed there at the bottom of the screen right now, the OSU Climate Change Team would like to thank you for your participation in this webinar. The OSU Climate Change Team is a partnership that extends to all corners of the Ohio State University. We began meeting in 2008, and the intention of this group was to categorize the current resources in climate change at Ohio State, to build a website, and to provide programs that provide educational resources on climate change. And ultimately, we want to link new research results from the university with the public. This webinar is the first webinar in our series of webinars. Future webinars that we're planning will look at the impacts and implications of climate change for ecosystems and the impacts and implications of climate change for water resources, not only in the state of Ohio, but throughout the Midwest. Like me, I think you probably undoubtedly recognize that climate change has become one of the more widely debated issues in contemporary American politics. As the White House contemplates regulating greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act, Congress is debating potential legislation on climate change. Those of us on college campuses see it in our students' eyes. They're hungry to participate in a society that addresses great challenges. Climate change is one of those great challenges. This webinar was intended to address three key issues. First, we wanted to look at some background on the science of climate change. Second, we wanted to look at some background on one of the most controversial components of currently proposed legislation, namely cap and trade. And third, we wanted to have a discussion about the economic implications of cap and trade for Ohioans and a discussion about the potential for land-based offset. We have 5 experts here who can help us understand these issues, and I want to briefly introduce them now. The way we've organized the webinar is that we'll have the presenters talk and give their talks in about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up hopefully for about a half hour of dialogue and question and answer. Ellen Mosley Thompson is a professor in the Department of Geography. She's the director of the Bird Polar Research Center at Ohio State University. She's an acclaimed climatologist. She's won many awards, and she's also a member of the prestigious National Academy of Sciences. Tom Blaine is an associate professor in OSU Extension. He's a natural resource economist who has studied the economics of numerous environmental issues, including protection of ecosystem services and climate change. Tim Haab is a professor in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics at Ohio State University. In addition to teaching, researching, and writing one of the most widely read books on environmental evaluation, he writes an influential blog on environmental economics. Bill Stanley is the Director of Conservation in Ohio for the Nature Conservancy. Before he came to Ohio, he worked for the Nature Conservancy internationally on carbon offset projects, and he's one of the world's leading experts on designing, setting up, and financing carbon sequestration projects in forestry and other land use opportunities. And I'm Brent Sohngen, a professor in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics at Ohio State University. So our ground rules for today, as we get started, are as follows. First, each of the presenters will give 10-minute talks with slides in the order shown on the screen right now. We'll just go from one speaker to the next, and we'll try to get that done in about 50 minutes. If you have questions as we go, please put your questions in the chat board, and go ahead and send your questions to everybody. Remember that the golden rule is that all good questions are good questions. So please go ahead and send your questions out. I'll keep track of those during the session, and at the end, for the last half hour, I'll moderate the discussion by using the questions you have sent during the entire set of presentations or at the end, and I'll prompt our panelists with specific questions drawn from those you have sent. Please feel free also to email me questions if you prefer to use that. I'll have my email available and working. Okay, our session is being recorded and will be available later for you to look at or for others you know to look at on our website. That website is www.ohiowatersheds.osu.edu/climate. We'll be sending that out to everybody on here, so I won't repeat that now. Finally, I want everyone to know that at the end of this, we're going to have an evaluation. We'll post a link to the evaluation, and we'll hope that you'll take a few minutes at the end, probably no more than 3 to 4 minutes of your time, to fill out that evaluation. We appreciate your willingness to help on that. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Dr. Mosley Thompson. Ellen, the floor should be yours, and I'm going to go ahead and pass on the ball here to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to let you know this is my first webinar, so I'm electronically challenged here. My task today is to discuss with you the nature of our understanding of global climate and environmental change. And the first slide that you see is shows the Earth at night. This is the human footprint on the planet. It essentially shows the use of electricity across the globe. Well, the meteorological record that extends back well into the 19th century confirms that the Earth is warming. The graph that you see shows the globally average temperature of the planet, and we know that 2005 was the warmest year on record, and since 1900, the globally average temperature has increased about 0.75 degrees centigrade. We also know that the climate is changing differently across the globe. So if you look at the right panel, you'll see the mean surface temperature anomaly for the last 7 years, and you'll see the spatial distribution that and this shows you that the greatest warming has been at the high northern latitudes and in the Antarctic Peninsula. I'm going to try to get which is here. Hopefully you can see the little ball. Just a minute. I guess I can't advance the slide and point. Doesn't seem to be working. Okay, there we go. So environmental conditions are changing. We always talk about climate, but we forget that it's really the environment that's important. Some of the changes that we're observing are unprecedented for thousands of years, and some of these changes are occurring rapidly on decades of years on time scales of years to decades. And the problem is that rapid climate changes pose severe challenges for adaptation, both for humans and for other living creatures. Now, over Earth history, the Earth's climate has varied, and it has been forced by natural mechanisms, such as changes in the output of the sun, changes in the amount of volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere. They tend to have a cooling effect, and internal variability of these coupled ocean atmosphere systems, such as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, that affects, for example, the coast of California. Variability in monsoon systems, that affects the rainfall in southern Asia, and the North Atlantic Oscillation, which affects climate around the North Atlantic. But we also know that human factors influence climate, and some of the non-natural factors include the changes in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And these are principally carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and also CFCs. These are what are called the heat-trapping gases. Essentially, they keep heat from leaving the Earth atmosphere system, and therefore, as their concentrations increase, basic physics says that the Earth atmosphere system must warm. Human activities also change the aerosols and the particles in the atmosphere. So burning of fossil fuels, particularly coal, puts sulfate aerosols in the atmosphere. They tend to have a cooling effect. And the burning of biomass puts black carbon into the atmosphere. That tends to have a warming effect. And then land use changes change the reflectivity or the albedo of the Earth's surface, and then that also affects the amount of radiation in the system. Just wanted to focus on carbon dioxide. You'll see the graph. Have the pointer up. This is the observed record that started in 1958. It is a short record. You can see the trend. However, bubbles from that are preserved in ice cores, and I'll try to point them out in this thin section panel here. Air can be extracted from these bubbles, and then that provides us an idea of what the pre-anthropogenic level of CO2 has been. And we can do the same thing for methane and the other gases. You see that the pre-anthropogenic level of CO2 is 280 parts per million. More recent ice cores have been used to extend that record back over 800,000 years. So this is almost a million-year record that you're seeing in the lower panel. The blue curve shows you the concentrations of CO2. You can see that over that 800,000-year history, CO2 has not risen above 300 parts per million. Methane, shown in red, has not increased above 800 parts per billion. And what you see here are the warm interglacial and glacial periods. So this would be a warm period, the Holocene, the last 10,000 years. Then the prior glaciation that lasted about 100,000 years. So we have interglacials, glacials, interglacials, and glacials. Today, the CO2 is about 387 parts per million, and methane is 1,800 parts per billion. And the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, projections for those the concentration of those gases in 2100 is shown here, 850 parts per million for CO2. Now, this is a moderate emission scenario called the A1B scenario. The problem with CO2 is that it remains in the atmosphere 70 to 100 years, and in fact, of the CO2 emitted today, 19% will still be in the atmosphere 1,000 years from now. Methane has a lifetime in the atmosphere of about 10 years. Now, many observed changes, there are many observed changes that are broadly consistent with an increase in the radiative heating of the Earth's surface in the lower atmosphere. One of these that I work with most closely is the recent and the rapid melting of glaciers in non-polar regions around the world. If you look at the map, you'll see these areas in red. Those are areas where glaciers are in retreat. In fact, the glaciers in bulk on every continent are retreating. So climatologically, we're in unfamiliar territory, and the world's ice cover is responding dramatically. For example, the glaciers in Glacier National Park are expected to disappear within the next few decades. The glaciers in the Himalaya are showing massive retreat. Throughout the Andes, the glaciers there are retreating. And probably best known is that the ice fields on Kilimanjaro have lost 85% of their ice cover since 1912. Other observations include the dramatic decreases in the aerial coverage and the thickness of Arctic sea ice. This has tremendous implications politically, economically, and climatologically. Also, the global ocean surface temperatures have increased about 0.35 degrees C since 1979. The warming is evident at all latitudes and over all ocean basins, and the warming extends to depths of 3,000 meters. There have been decreases in the area of seasonally frozen ground in the high northern latitudes. That would be the permafrost. There is a concern there with regard to the release of methane that has been stored for thousands of years. Also, river and lake ice in the north has shown a reduction in its annual duration. Sea level is rising. We have increases in the atmospheric moisture content. This means increased evaporation. That means increased surface drying. We've had changes in extremes that are consistent with anthropogenic-induced warming. We've had an increase in heat waves globally, widespread increases in warm nights, rarer occurrences of colder days, colder nights, and days with frost. So these many independent observations and the physical consistency among them formed the basis for the 2007 conclusion by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that warming of the climate is unequivocal. The IPCC also put forth a second very important summary statement that most of the observed increase in globally average temperatures since mid-century, or since around 1950, has very likely been due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And you'll note the asterisk, and that means that very likely means that the IPCC was comfortable with that statement with a 90% confidence level. Now, in the next slide, we'll show you the experiments, the results of experiments that underpin that second IPCC summary statement. If you just take a look at the bottom panel that says global, this shows the 20th century. Here's the year 2000, here's 1900. And these are the global the globally average temperature in this panel. The solid line are the observations. Now, when the top IPCC models, there were 19 to 23 of these models were used, and those models were essentially asked to hindcast or to project backward the globally average temperature. And of course, the test is, can they match the observations? Now, when the models were forced with natural forcings only, that's shown here in blue, you'll see the models did fairly well until about mid-century. And it's only when both natural and anthropogenic forcings are used in the models are the models able to capture the warming of the second half of the 20th century, not just globally, but over land, over the ocean, and for all of the continents. The IPCC's fourth assessment projection for 2100 in terms of the globally average temperature that we might expect is shown here in red. And that range is a globally averaged increase in the temperature of 2 to 4.5 degrees C, with a mid-range value of probably around 3 degrees centigrade. Now, I'm shown this with the temperature history for the last 1,000 years as derived from numerous proxy recording devices, such as tree rings, ice cores, etc. And you can see that we're really stepping outside the range of natural variability. So kind of as a summary, the global average surface temperature is heading not only far outside the range of variation for the last 1,000 years, but actually outside the range experienced during the tenure of Homo sapiens on the planet. So that much warming has occurred. That's where we are today. And our future energy policies and our agricultural policies will determine where we're going to fall on this continuum between 2 and 4.5 degrees C with regard to the globally average temperature. And I just wanted to close and call your attention to a recent assessment published in 2009 by the U.S. Global Change Research Program on the global climate change impacts in the U.S. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Brent. I do want to thank you, Brent, for hosting the webinar. It's a real privilege to be here with everyone today. I am Tom Blaine. I'm Associate Professor with Ohio State University Extension. And I'm going to be talking about outlook to the year 2050, mid-century, for Ohio today. I want to first start by saying that Ohio's climate has been changing. As Ellen pointed out, we have seen some climate change thus far, and that's certainly the case for Ohio. It is about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in our decade, this first decade of the 21st century, than it was in the 1860s, about the time when modern methods began for measuring and recording temperatures. The northern portion of the state has warmed more than the south, and it's also received more precipitation, while the south has gotten a little bit drier. If we go ahead and look out to 2050, it appears, based on the climate models that I've seen, that Ohio's average warming will probably be roughly the same as for the planet generally. Now, we could consider different kinds of scenarios as far as CO2 concentrations go. As Ellen pointed out, we're at about 390 parts per million right now in carbon dioxide. Difficult to say. It depends a lot on policies and so forth, but one of the mid-range projections out to 2050 is 450 parts per million. If that occurs, it seems likely that an average warming of about 1.75 to 2 degrees, and I am using Fahrenheit here. So if we consider about a 2 degree Fahrenheit increase between now and 2050, in Ohio, this would cause climate zones to shift. And we can imagine northern tier counties, for example, counties like Richland, Hancock, Wayne, Medina, Mahoning counties, these counties would have climates that we currently see in the southern tier counties like Adams, Scioto, those counties down along the Ohio River. So imagine just shifting up counties throughout Ohio, shifting up 5, 6, or 7 counties to get to the kind of climate we would see by mid-century in Ohio. Now, in general, this would mean Ohio's climate by 2050 would be about like the current climate we see in the state of Missouri, more or less. That's a state that I would say would be the most similar now to the kind of climate that we would have by 2050. Climate models seem to indicate that the greatest temperature changes tend to occur at cooler ends of the temperature spectrum. And so for Ohio, this would mean that we would have greater temperature changes in winter months than at other times of the year. This would mean our winters would be considerably milder than they are today. As I think most of you are aware, it is typical now, it's more the rule rather than the exception for Lake Erie to freeze in the wintertime. We have ice fishing and so forth on Lake Erie. Many of you may remember the winter of 2001, 2002. I call that the winter that wasn't the exceptionally mild winter, and Lake Erie did not freeze that winter. I think by 2050, that kind of winter, especially for Lake Erie not freezing, that kind of winter will be more the rule rather than the exception with these current trends. Winters will be rainier and less snowy in Ohio. However, there will be an increased tendency toward more ice storms. Those are freezing rain events. Those kinds of events, when you have freezing rain, they're typically more common in the southern United States now than up north. They are brought about largely by warm air masses intermingling at different elevations with cold air masses, and therefore they tend to occur more in the south, but with a 2-degree warming, they will be more common here in Ohio by 2050. I want to talk a little bit about Lake Erie. Over the years, there has been quite a bit of literature indicating that the levels of the Great Lakes, especially Lake Erie, will likely fall due to increased evaporation and use of water resources for irrigation. For example, in the winter now, as I pointed out, Lake Erie tends to freeze, and during that time, there's very little or no evaporation at all from the lake. But if you have open water throughout the winter, as I indicated will be the case by mid-century, there will be evaporation through the winter. And this will lower Lake Erie's level. Also, warmer summers will cause increased evaporation. That will lower the level, and use of water resources for irrigation will cause a lower level of Lake Erie. A colleague of mine recently pointed out that there have been some new studies that indicate with severe rain events, there will be more runoff. When you have a severe rain event, you get more runoff, less percolation into the soil. And some of the models are taking that into consideration, indicating that maybe the drop in Lake Erie will not occur, or it won't be as much. I think when it comes to forecasting those severe weather events, there are some problems with those forecasts, but it is a possibility. However, again, there's been considerable literature that indicates that the level of Lake Erie is likely to fall. If that occurs, this will present challenges for navigation, for marinas. It will require more frequent dredging of channels and marina areas. Also, cold water fish species will be at a disadvantage in a warmer Lake Erie. Muskie and trout would be disadvantaged. Warm water species like bluegill and bass would have an advantage. Another colleague of mine pointed out the other day that, a lot of times trout are stocked in Lake Erie, and that's true. I mean, management matters. Many of these changes can be mitigated by management. So if we lose habitat and so forth for some of these species, we can still stock cold water species, and this may allow them to survive even in a warmer lake, but they will be at a disadvantage. Agriculture, huge industry in Ohio, and of course most agricultural activities take place outdoors, and that will continue to be the case in the future. A lot of challenges for agriculture, a lot of opportunities. First of all, I want to point out that farmers are resilient. They tend to adapt. They make use of information and education. And Ohio State University Extension, we reach out to agricultural producers and give them education. I think they use that and respond well. I think they will do so in the case of warmer temperatures with our education that we have for them. And they will adapt. For example, in northern Ohio, currently we don't have enough heat to produce the kinds of corn that is produced in southern Ohio along the Ohio River. 120-day corn is very common there. There's not enough heat in northern Ohio to produce 120-day corn. We have 105, 110-day variety. But that will shift. That will change. And farmers need to be educated about the opportunities that will present, because by 2050, we will see 120-day corn produced in northern Ohio. We will have enough heat for that production. At the same time, as the South warms up, there will be opportunities for warm weather crops that currently cannot flourish there, such as cotton. I pointed out Missouri as a comparison state. In southern Missouri, you have about 12 counties that currently produce cotton. Cotton is not produced in central and northern Missouri because there's just not enough heat to sustain the crop. It's likely by mid-century that cotton will be introduced into southern Ohio. More challenges and opportunities for agriculture. There's a lot of literature on the impacts of heat stress, and heat and humidity on livestock, but particularly OSU's own Norman St. Pierre, this area. He's produced studies that show that milk per cow is negatively associated with higher summer temperatures. And, of course, dairy is very important in Ohio, throughout the state. So this will be a challenge. Not to say we'll lose the dairy industry. I'm not indicating that, but I'm saying this will be a challenge for dairy farmers as we have a warmer Ohio because of the heat stress on dairy herds. Also, an increased tendency for summer drought is forecast in many climate models. This will be a challenge to farmers. It's likely that will lead to more reliance on irrigation. I want to talk about household energy. We use much of our energy heating and cooling our homes. If you stop and think about it, greater temperature increases in the winter indicate that winter household heating requirements will fall probably more rapidly than the increased demand for cooling in the summer, because there is forecast to be more warming in the winter than in summer. So on net, that would bring about a reduction in overall energy demand as far as heating and cooling homes. Again, as I was saying earlier, management matters, decisions matter. Decisions agricultural producers make, those matter. Wildlife managers. Much of what happens in the state is going to depend on how we respond, how we as Ohioans respond, in terms of education, in terms of management of our resources. There'll be a lot of challenges, but there'll also be opportunities in living in a warmer Ohio. I want to point out some of the references and suggested readings as I close here. That first reference, Climate Change Impacts on the United States, is a 2004 report. That was an update of a previous report. It's excellent. The initial one, I believe, came out in 2000. A colleague of mine pointed out there's now a 2009 update that's recently become available. But that is excellent reading. They lay out the information very clearly, and I've always enjoyed reading those updates. NASA's Eyes on the Earth is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and that is a very good resource. I'm plugging my own fact sheet there I initially wrote when I came to OSU, 1996. It's the basic introduction to global climate change, and it's available online. It's been there for 13 years, but it's got a basic introduction on the topic. And I'm updating that now with the Global Climate Change Update 2010, which hopefully will be online in a couple of months. There's St. Pierre and others piece that I cited from Journal of Dairy Science, Economic Losses from Heat Stress by U.S. Livestock Industry. Christie and Spencer data, especially the satellite temperature data, over the past 30 years. And they produced an enormous amount of data that's very useful in understanding current temperature trends. And then finally, the 2007 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the IPCC, that many are familiar with. Here's my contact information, and there's my email and phone. I'd be happy to come and address any group that you have. I am with OSU Extension. We do take the University of the Public. I'd be happy to come and address your group. Or if you'd like to email me or phone with questions, if you'd like more information on global climate change in general or impacts on Ohio in particular, I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.
So the topic that I've got today is what is cap and trade and what do legislative proposals currently in Congress say about it? The first thing to address, of course, is what is the cap and trade system? Essentially, a cap and trade system starts with setting a limit on CO2 emissions. That limit is the cap. The second part of this is the trading part, which allows those large emitters to trade the carbon dioxide amongst themselves. So let's think about how we might actually do a cap and trade system in practice. The first thing we might think about is that if you look at this simple example of two factories, those two factories maybe emit initially 3,000 tons of carbon dioxide emission, and perhaps the government comes along and says, well, we want to get that down to 2,700 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's the first decision that has to be made in any cap and trade system. They have to decide on what that overall cap is and make a decision there. The next step in a cap and trade system is to have a look at those individual firms. So in this case, we have two firms. And we look out and we see that one of those firms emits 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and the other firm emits 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So the government then has to say, okay, how are we going to allocate this 2,700 tons to those two firms? So maybe they'll just do it proportionally and say those firms will get permits. That firm on the left, the green firm, the newer firm, will get 900 permits, so they would be allowed to emit 900 tons of carbon dioxide. The firm on the right, the older one, maybe would get 1,800 permits. 900 plus 1,800 equals 2,700. So if those firms met their commitments and only emitted 900 or 1,800, they would meet the total cap, and we would be just fine. The second part, or really the third part of this, is then you allow those firms to trade. What you recognize is that one of those firms might be really good and really efficient at reducing carbon dioxide. So for example, the new firm on the left, maybe they're pretty good. Maybe they're able to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions pretty efficiently and pretty cheaply, so they can fairly cheaply get down to 700 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. The firm on the right, being a bit older, maybe having older technologies, maybe it's a little more expensive for them to try to meet this 1,800 ton cap. So they actually plan on hitting a 2,000 ton cap. Well, they're going to be over their number of permits, and they're going to have to go out and find someone to trade with. So they'll go to the other firm and ask that firm, can we buy those 200 tons from you? And if those two firms can come up with a reasonable price, then they'll be able to make that negotiation work. So in this way, the total emission will be 2,700 tons, but it'll be allocated differently than the initial cap that was set on the two plants. And that's what makes carbon trading and cap and trading a fairly efficient way to do emission reductions. Of course, there's many more than two firms, and there can be an actual marketplace, and with more and more firms, it can make this even more efficient. Now, another area where we might be able to reduce costs a bit more is the idea that we could allow some credits to come into the market from land-based sources. So agricultural or forestry sources could potentially supply additional credits to this market and further reduce the price and the total cost of meeting the cap. There is a big debate, it's important to recognize that, on these land-based credits. From my perspective, the scientific uncertainties about this issue have mostly been resolved, and we also realize that these land-based credits are big enough potentially to provide 30% of the total carbon abatement for the world, and they could reduce costs for all of us by up to 40%. So if we really are serious about meeting some of these very stringent carbon targets, land-based resources can be a really important part of that. And the second component is as we'll talk about in a second, our national laws are starting, or some of the discussion of national legislation is asking the question whether we should do both carbon sequestration on the land within the country and carbon sequestration out of the country. Should we send some dollars to other countries to do carbon sequestration on the landscape for us? And the economics of this suggest that the national program, what we do in the country, would be much more efficient if we have an out-of-country or international program tied to it. These two things are complements, not substitutes. Whatever we do inside the country, we make better by doing something outside the country. I won't talk much more about that, but do note that that's an important research result that we've discovered in the last several years. So just to summarize some of the pros and cons that are out there about cap and trade programs, on the pro side, a cap will actually limit emissions. This is much different than, say, for example, renewable portfolio standards, which actually don't limit emissions at all. Things could grow around the system, and so a cap actually will put a limit in place where other things won't. It establishes a clear price signal. That clear price signal is what we really need to start giving people incentives to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide. It imposes a stringency of the market on abatement decisions so that money then flows to the best alternatives. And this is the way that we're able to reduce the costs. On the con side, it creates a difficult negotiation over the rights for the permits. And that's what I would argue is most of the conversation around the legislation is how we deal with these rights for these permits. Do we auction them? Do we allocate them? If we're going to allocate them for free, who gets the free permits? This is not really an efficiency argument, but this is really a debate over what we do with the rights and the resources that flow in this cap and trade system. A con, from some people's perspective, is that it can be very, very stringent. Unlike a renewable portfolio standard, unlike some of the other mechanisms we might use, a cap and trade system is actually a set of rules that puts a very stringent cap in place. It's something we actually have to meet. This can actually be fairly costly. And in the long run, those costs could actually come back to hurt our society in some ways if this cap is potentially set at too stringent of a level. So it does create a con in the sense that it's a very difficult benefit-cost analysis about just how stringent this cap should be. So let me turn to talking a bit about a climate policy update and talk a bit about where we are. As many of you know, the United Nations process continues. The Kyoto Protocol, we're in the commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol now. Markets are active in other parts of the world, and there is international trading through what we call the Clean Development Mechanism. We're starting to talk about, or we have been talking for a number of years about, a successor treaty to the Kyoto Protocol. There might have been some initial speculation that we would try to get a Copenhagen Protocol with this big meeting that's going to occur in Copenhagen this fall. Right now, most people, as far as I can tell, seem to think that there probably won't be a treaty coming out of this meeting this fall. The U.S., for example, is re-engaging in this process, but is also trying to set its expectations fairly low for this Copenhagen meeting. Probably what we'll see is that will continue, that negotiations will continue well beyond this Copenhagen meeting. Regardless, U.S. policy is very active. We have regional initiatives. California has put a cap in place. There's a cap on carbon emissions in the northern states, this regional greenhouse gas emissions RGGI area. That's 13 northeastern states putting a cap on their carbon emissions. We have a Supreme Court decision which is putting pressure on the government. That Supreme Court decision says that the U.S. EPA has the right and the responsibility to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Air Act amendments. And so that's putting pressure on Congress to actually do something. We have energy legislation also occurring. And we should also note that really this country has moved a long way from 1997 in the last 12 years. In that year, the Senate voted 95-0 on the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, basically telling the government at that time, the president at that time, not to sign the Kyoto Protocol. We've moved a long way, and now we have an actual bill that has passed the House of Representatives on climate change. So let me jump over to that. The key issues with the Waxman-Markey bill, this was House Resolution 2454, which passed back in the spring. One of the biggest components of that, of course, is the carbon cap and trade system. What Waxman and Markey recommended in terms of their cap was a fairly small cap in 2012, a more stringent cap in 2020, basically a 17% cap on our total carbon dioxide emissions. By 2030, we would have a 42% cap on our carbon dioxide emissions, so we would reduce carbon dioxide emissions 42% by 2030, and by 2050, we would reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by 80%. This is pretty close to meeting about a 550 part per million, or maybe a 2 to 2.2 degrees centigrade change in temperature limit over the next century if the rest of the world were to do the same thing that we were to do. So this is a very stringent set of policies and puts us on a path towards a substantial reduction in our carbon emissions. Of course, the big discussion in Waxman-Markey was how to allocate those permits. And one of the things that came out of that was that they made a real effort, a concerted effort, to do the allocation in such a way that local distribution companies in states like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc., would get a large free allocation of permits, and this was designed to try to limit the price increase for electricity for consumers in those states. So a big part of Waxman-Markey was to put this cap in place, but then to allocate the permits in a way to try to mitigate the effects on consumers of electricity, especially in coal-burning states in the near future. Another component that they had in the Waxman-Markey bill was offsets. They allowed up to 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide offsets from the land-based sector with up to 1 billion tons from outside the U.S. They also included a renewable portfolio standard so that by 2020, 20% of our electricity could come from renewables. Okay, so the Senate would also have to act, and recently Senators Kerry and Boxer have introduced a bill for discussion this fall. In reading, of course I haven't actually read the full bill, but looking at some of the information that's posted about it, it looks like there are a lot of similarities between that bill and the House bill, but some important differences. One of the things that seems to be coming out is we're not quite sure if the stars are going to align and we're going to be able to get enough support. But after this weekend, when Senators Kerry and Senator Graham put a joint op-ed in the New York Times, there was renewed hope that it's possible that the Senate could make action, because here is one of the key Republicans coming on board and saying, you know what, I could support something like this. Here are the 3 things we have to have if you're going to get support. Those 3 things are is you're going to have to support nuclear power. You're going to have to figure out ways to enhance the potential for nuclear power to become a big part of whatever we do in the future. You're going to have to enhance the potential for clean coal. So we're going to have to keep coal as an important part of our mix. We're going to have to figure out ways to potentially subsidize clean coal technologies. The third thing is we'll have to have border tax adjustments. We'll have to do things that keep out cheap imports from other countries that don't have the same kinds of regulations in place on their greenhouse gases as we do. And I have put stars on this because I think this is one of the key things, as far as I can tell from senators in the Midwestern U.S., this is a key issue that I think will drive some of the senators in this part of the country in terms of their conversations about this bill. And it's not something that economists are necessarily happy with, but I think it's going to be a key component of future negotiations. So in summary, cap and trade works by limiting overall emissions. It reduces costs relative to other methods of achieving the same goal. And that's the important point. Cap and trade systems reduce costs relative to other methods of achieving the same goal. For sure, just going with some renewable portfolio standards, just going with maybe a slight carbon tax or something like that, maybe going with some best available control technology methods, those things can reduce our costs, but they don't achieve the same goal. Cap and trade is the only way to achieve a specific goal in carbon reductions, and the trading part is the only way to keep those costs low. Land-based offsets are likely to be important, and they're in both the House and the Senate versions of the bill, slightly different. We'll probably see both domestic and international components of that. Important to recognize that policy is moving forward with or without federal legislation, and it's interesting to watch that system play out. And I just pointed out a few of the important questions related to the role of nuclear, coal, renewables, and border tax adjustments. Those are going to be the key issues.
Brent just described a cap and trade program, and he's asked me to talk a little bit about cap and trade and its role and possible effects in Ohio. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not an extension economist. I work a lot in research and teaching. So a lot of what I talk about is going to come from some research that I'm doing with a chemical engineer here at Ohio State, Bob Bakshi, and a statistician from Grinnel, on a National Science Foundation funded project to develop an integrated engineering and economic model of basically it's of transportation sectors, but it sort of broadens from that to be more of a project looking at Ohio in particular and the effects of various pricing schemes, and we can use it for things like carbon pricing. So when we think about cap and trade, what we're really talking about is a case where what we're doing is increasing the price of carbon, or placing a price on carbon. So the price of carbon will increase, and the question we want to have is, what are the possible effects there on Ohio? So this is some preliminary work that's come out of the model that we're developing, and just to give you an idea of the types of results that come out of the model and some of the potential impacts in Ohio, what we did in one of the scenarios is considered a 5 cents per kilogram of carbon price increase. And just to give you an idea of what that's equivalent to, that's roughly equivalent to $35 a ton of coal, $5 per barrel of oil, or about $28 per cubic meter, per 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas. Just thinking about that in percentage terms, that's about 25% increase in the price of each of those at the time we were doing this analysis. It's actually a slightly bigger increase now. The price of all three of those has dropped recently. And just to relate that to what people are talking about in the legislature, the Waxman-Markey bill and the Boxer-Kerry bill. The Boxer-Kerry bill is the Senate version of the proposed Senate version of the cap and trade bill. They set the reserve allowance price at about $28 a ton, which translates to about roughly 3 cents per kilogram. So we're talking about the scenario we're talking about here is slightly higher than the reserve allowance price in the in Congress's bill. So our model predicts that the majority of reductions, not surprisingly, in carbon dioxide will fall on power generation. About 74% of the reductions in carbon dioxide will fall in the power generation sector, about 10% transportation, about 8% manufacturing. It's going to be important as we move along here to keep those three sectors in mind: power generation, transportation, and manufacturing. It's going to have important implications for Ohio. So why should Ohio care about the fact that those three sectors are going to be affected? Well, Ohio in 2008, Ohio generated about 13 million megawatt hours of electricity. If we look at that on a per state basis, Ohio falls in the top quarter, but not necessarily right up the top. But if we consider what type of electricity Ohio generates, 99.4% of that, the electricity that Ohio generates is coal-fired. And so if we look at coal-fired electricity generation by state, Ohio is third to Texas and Indiana. So why should Ohio care so much about that? Well, our model predicts that due to the high carbon content of coal, carbon pricing will have large impacts on coal prices and production, and manufacturing, and transportation and warehousing. And keep in mind, those are the three sectors that are going to be hit the hardest. So if we look at coal-fired electricity, what we predict is that the percentage change in prices due to carbon pricing would be about roughly about 15% increase in coal-fired electricity pricing, about a 10% increase in petroleum-fired electricity prices. And just to keep in mind, Brent mentioned that one of the big issues surrounding cap and trade is the allocation of the permits. This analysis right now doesn't take into account any return of revenues back to the affected states, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you look at the changes in production due to carbon pricing, you can see that coal-fired electricity, these are three different scenarios that we ran. Coal-fired electricity is going to fall roughly 2 to 3% due to the carbon pricing. You'll see decreases in coal mining. You'll also see decreases in petroleum-fired electricity, large decreases. And one here. And if you look at where the carbon revenues are going to come from, this is who's going to pay basically the price for the carbon pricing. You can see that the majority of revenues come from coal-fired electricity, manufacturing, and transportation, the same three sectors that are the largest generators. Now, if you think about that, that seems reasonable. Those that produce the carbon dioxide or that are reducing the carbon dioxide are the ones that are going to have to pay the revenues. Why should we care about that in Ohio? Fairly simply, if you look at the percentage of GDP in those three sectors, utilities, manufacturing, and transportation and warehousing, those three sectors make up about 24% of Ohio's economy. You compare that to the rest of the United States. In the rest of the United States, those three sectors make up about 17% of the GDP. So in other words, Ohio is at the high end of the concentration of those three sectors, which means that they're going to be disproportionately affected by carbon pricing. So why should Ohio care about cap and trade or carbon pricing? Ohio's economy is heavily invested in industries likely to be most affected by carbon prices relative to other states. But in addition to that, Ohio is poorly positioned to adapt to a shift to renewable energy production. So if you look at current renewable energy production, this is non-hydro and non-nuclear renewable energy production. Texas and California are far out in front. And if you look at Ohio, Ohio is lagging far behind in terms of investment in renewable energy. All right, so one of the things that Brent asked me to talk briefly about is the issue of jobs, because one of the issues that comes up a lot in talking about these types of policies, big policies that affect large sectors, is, well, can we possibly use these to kill two birds with one stone? Can we create a new economy where we have green jobs at the same time that we're managing climate? Well, the issue here is really quite simple. Can we get effective policy in two different places? Or, as I'll explain in just a second, sometimes when we try to kill two birds with one stone, we end up getting what has recently become known as a soggy dinner. And where that comes from is a quote from Rob Stabens, who's an economist at Harvard University in the Kennedy School of Government there. And someone asked him, why can't we address job creation and climate policy both at the same time? And his reaction was to give an analogy. Let's say that I want to have a dinner party. It's important that I cook dinner, and I'd like to take a shower before the guests arrive. You might think, well, it would be really efficient for me to cook dinner in the shower. But it turns out, as I try that, I'm going to get very clean. I'm not going to get very clean, and it's not going to be a very good dinner. So in other words, if you try to do two things at once, what you might end up doing is doing two things poorly. So when we talk about effective stimulus and we talk about climate policy, what we should really be doing is talking about those as separate goals. Yes, climate policy will have an effect on jobs, and it's likely to, depending on how the policy is designed, you would see shifts in jobs from what we'll call dirty sectors to cleaner sectors. But that's not necessarily saying that we're going to be creating jobs. So a lot of times when you see these statements that certain policies will create jobs, what's often missing from those is that these policies also cost jobs. It's just where they create them and where they cost them that they're talking about. So when you see job creation, you need to be careful in talking about net gains versus gross gains in jobs. So using carbon policy to target stimulus or vice versa can result in both bad climate policy and bad economic stimulus. Now, we're in a bit of a unique situation here because we are talking about times of high unemployment right now. So a lot of these arguments I've just talked about may only hold when we're talking about times of full employment. So if we do have unemployment, we may get a net job gain from any type of policy. But again, that's just a side benefit of the policy. We shouldn't be viewing that as necessarily the target for that policy. So what's the takeaway from the research that I've done to this point? Preliminary analysis shows that any type of carbon pricing will result in disproportionate economic impact on states heavily invested in coal-fired electricity generation, manufacturing, and transportation and warehousing. Ohio is currently underinvested in renewable energy production relative to similar states. The historic economic reliance of Ohio and similar states on coal-based electricity generation, manufacturing, and transportation and warehousing means Ohio will disproportionately absorb the economic impact of carbon pricing. But an open question, and as Brent brought it up a little bit, an open question remains how best to allocate the carbon pricing revenues once collected to ensure long-term economic sustainability of states disproportionately reliant on carbon-intensive production. In other words, when the government sells the allowances or the permits for carbon dioxide, they generate revenues. The analysis we've done so far doesn't take into account what happens to that revenue. If that revenue is fed back into states that are disproportionately affected by the cap-and-trade system, then you may be able to at least partially remedy some of the negative impacts of those of the cap-and-trade system that's disproportionately affecting Ohio. So that's the end. Here I list the website that I run with John Whitehead out of Appalachian State. This is the Environmental Economics blog. If you're interested in environmental topics from an economist perspective, you can take a look at that. I also give you the email address here. Feel free to send me your questions, or I'd be glad to answer them as we go along.
I want to start by thanking you, Brent, and OSU for having me today. And just to let you know, the Nature Conservancy has been working in this area of land-based carbon offsets for over 15 years now, and most of our experience has been outside of the U.S. But I like to say that tropical forests don't have a patent on photosynthesis, so this is something that we can do here in the U.S. Since plants capture carbon dioxide, a major greenhouse gas, they're an important part of the solution globally. So Brent had mentioned a bit in his presentation the role of land-based credits or offsets and its ability to kind of reduce costs in the cap and trade. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into some of these land-based solutions. So there has been a lot of concern that the cost of cap and trade will be a big problem for farmers given increased energy and associated fertilizer costs. But there are also a number of new opportunities that can be offered for cap and trade. USDA has done some analysis of the cost and benefits, and their analysis suggested that economic opportunities for farmers and ranchers could outpace and potentially significantly so the cost from climate legislation. That's one analysis, and just from talking to folks like Brent and others, it sounds like most experts agree that there are, at least in the way that Waxman-Markey is formulated, a lot of upside opportunities for farmers, and depending on where you live, they're likely to outweigh the cost. And that seems to be the case in Ohio. So what are some of these potential benefits for landowners? First, the new green energy economy is going to require land for biomass energy production. That can be done in ways that certainly have big climate benefits. We've seen some mistakes in that area too, in the ethanol area. There's going to be land rental for wind farms. New crops, things like switchgrass for biofuels will be available. And there's likely to be some new incentive programs provided to farmers to reduce emissions. So there's some numbers there. These are from the USDA study where you can see some of the amounts that are expected to be open to farmers. As you can see from that, the biggest potential source of income is from offsets. So according to USDA, at least, offsets could provide billions of dollars every year to land managers. And that has been backed up by studies from others, which I'll get into a little bit more later. So at this point, I want to really just get into the offsets area. I think from Brent's presentation, you got a sense of what offsets are. This is kind of a simple diagram that gets you to the concept that one of the nice things, if you could say that about carbon emissions, is that they mix really quickly with the air, and unlike other pollutants that are kind of more localized, they spread around the entire planet. And what's nice about that is because of that, it doesn't really matter where carbon reductions take place. They can take place on the other side of the planet and have the same benefit to us in Ohio in terms of climate change that was we did in our own backyard in terms of the kind of global warming aspect of it. So that means that we could potentially trade offsets, from between Ohio and any other place and still have that benefit. So that's really what carbon offsets are, a form of trade. When you buy an offset, you end up funding and supporting projects that reduce carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas emissions. These projects take on many different types. They might restore forests, update power plants and factories, look at energy efficiency in buildings. Again, I'm going to get more into the land-based part of this. So, as Brent, I think, also mentioned, pretty much all proposed and operational cap and trade programs to reduce carbon emissions allow offsets. What this means is that regulated entities, those that are capped, could purchase either allowances from other emitters, as he explained, or they could purchase offset credits. These are from sources of emissions not covered by the cap, where you've been able to to reduce or capture emissions in the case of plants. So since green plants capture carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, stimulating that storage of carbon in plants, or through soil management, these can be parts of the solution to climate change. Again, offsets can be domestic, or they can be international. And one of the things that's been discussed in the U.S. legislation in Waxman-Markey is how much of this may come from international forests. And internationally, there's a huge potential, and mainly through protecting tropical forests to really reduce emissions. I think a lot of people don't realize that deforestation internationally accounts for between somewhere in a range of 15 to 20% of global carbon dioxide emissions every year. So, there are some really cost-effective ways to reduce deforestation and those emissions and bring a lot of other benefits to the planet, even to the local economies and communities through carbon trading that the Nature Conservancy and others have been very interested in. And Waxman-Markey really supports these emissions reductions in tropical forests. And as you might have imagined, it's a huge area within the UN framework convention on climate change. A big focus on trying to address these emissions from tropical forests as a part of that. So, what is it about offsets that makes them so popular? I think, from an economist perspective, which I'm not, but there's several on the phone today, the main reason that they're so popular is because they really are a great tool for keeping down the cost of cap and trade. I think Brent mentioned a number of, say, 40%. He made his remark that they could reduce costs of compliance by up to 40%, as structured in Waxman-Markey. I've heard estimates somewhere in the range between 20 and 90%, depending on the analysis. So some other reasons, though, is that they do expand opportunities for landowners to benefit, build new contingencies that will support cap and trade. They kind of basically, cast the net more broadly and allow others to participate voluntarily. And finally, many of the activities that are good for storing carbon provide other benefits like clean water and habitat for conservation. It was really that interest in the habitat benefits that first got the Nature Conservancy involved in offsets. So there are hundreds, if not thousands or more, different types of activities that could help to offset emissions. There's a lot of debate going on about which activities should be included and how to include those. Some of the land-based activities that seem to show the greatest potential in the U.S. are improved forest management, afforestation, or basically putting trees back on the landscape where they once were but haven't been for some time, and conservation tillage are three that are talked about a lot. I think it's pretty easy to get a handle on afforestation or the tree planting and how that helps to reduce CO2. Basically, the trees capture the carbon and incorporate it into their wood, leaves, roots, and over time into the soils. And that's a nice project type because it's pretty easy to see the benefits. You can actually see the trees growing and see the carbon. At least that's what I see when I see trees and part of carbon. You can measure that over time. Improvements in forest management are a little bit harder, I think, for people to get a handle on. Some of the things you can do in forest management to help forest capture and store carbon are like extending rotation lengths. Say you were harvesting on every 25 years. If you just put that harvest off for another 5, 10 years, you end up storing more carbon across the landscape, which is a good thing for the atmosphere. You can also try to reduce impacts to plants and soils that are not being harvested. You can do things like increase buffer areas of forest around streams, riparian buffers. All those things can be helpful. They do have costs, but they have these carbon benefits as well. And finally, on the conservation tillage side, by not tilling soil, we can increase carbon stores in soils, at least in the top layers. There's been some interesting research coming out of OSU and the Tom Mall and others looking at conservation tillage. And I think the benefits of that, exactly what they are, still being kind of debated scientifically, but there seems to be some benefits in the top layers as well. So here in Ohio, actually, we do have a little bit of experience with carbon projects the Nature Conservancy does, we have a 500-acre project down in Adams County near the edge of Appalachian Preserve, near the Shawnee State Forest, where we planted about 27,000 oak and walnut trees around Ohio Brush Creek, and we're estimating that the project will capture around 75,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide over 40 years. Now, we've done other projects internationally, and over 1.5 million acres worth of projects across the planet. A lot of this, again, is in developing countries. But switching back to the U.S., even though there are these tremendous opportunities internationally, in the U.S. there really are some significant opportunities for land-based offsets and carbon sequestration. So this figure actually I got from the Pew Climate Change website, but it's based on analysis done by Brian Murray at Duke University, showing how much we might be able to get in terms of metric tons of carbon dioxide. You see that on the y-axis at different time frames based on the Waxman-Markey bill from different sources. It's a pretty nice graphic here showing where that might come from. And I think it can also give you a sense of the value of this and what it might be to landowners, kind of where could these offsets come from and what might it mean for landowners. So if you look at, say, the 2020 area, and it's got different prices there, different price assumptions, and I've been hearing that somewhere in the $15 to $20 range may be what we might expect to see. So if you assume, say, at 2020, a carbon price of $15 per ton of CO2, this study suggests that landowners can capture somewhere between $5 and $6 billion a year from the carbon market. So this is pretty significant amount of money, obviously. So if you look at it also and look at the makeup of that, you see the green and purple areas. Those are forest management and afforestation. So those look to be the two biggest opportunities. Even if you look at out through the years and at different prices, those seem to be the two biggest opportunities within the U.S. So that all sounds good, but the question is, will this promise really be delivered? What's it going to take to realize these benefits? So before you get too excited about it, we've got to look at what the regulations are going to require, and it's really important that we have high standards for these projects. We really have to make sure that they're working for the atmosphere and put a great deal of emphasis on their integrity. So as a part of Waxman-Markey, they have EPA working with the USDA on the land-based offsets. They would need to develop a way to measure how much carbon each activity would sequester in the soil or biomass. And there will be a number of requirements. For example, there's a term in carbon offset world called additionality. And basically what that's about is we don't want to give credits for things that are happening anyway. Even though there are a lot of good actors out there doing great things in the landscape, we can't allow emitters to simply buy credits for things that would have happened anyway. We need to make sure that whatever is being done is going to have a real impact on the atmosphere and a positive impact. So there's this term called additionality, which is a test to see is this likely to have happened without the conservation or the carbon funding. So an example of that would be how would you put that into practice? For example, with reforestation, one of the things that's been proposed is that the land will have needed to be out of forest for at least 10 years prior to the project beginning. You wouldn't want to give credit for something that was already happening, and you also wouldn't want to give credit for reforesting an area that was cut down, say, a year or two before, maybe even then cut down with the expectation of getting carbon credits later. You also need to be able to measure it. I mentioned some of the questions about conservation tillage already, which I could go into more detail, but with 10 minutes I won't. I will just say that there are some good techniques for measurement of carbon storage in land-based activities based on principles that have been being used for over 100 years in the forestry arena, and then some ecological measurement tools too for soil carbon and things like that. So the techniques do exist, but there is an expense, especially for some project types, it can be quite And another big requirement is this issue what's called permanence, that these carbon stores need to be kept for many years, not permanently. Permanently is kind of a philosophical term in my mind, but how long is long enough? How do you account for this? Is there a liability for losses? Because you wouldn't want to give a power company credit for tree planting if the tree were planted this year and simply cut down 3 or 4 years later, and whatever has been captured would then be re-emitted into the atmosphere potentially. So that's the concern there. I think that's going to be a major issue for landowners: is how long are they going to be willing to commit to a certain management type to keep the carbon sequestered. So in summary, I think offsets are really important to getting political support, lowering the cost of cap and trade. They can bring benefits, big benefits to landowners and to conservation. But we're really not going to know how attractive these opportunities will be and how useful offsets will be to reducing emissions until the standards are developed, which is likely to come after the development of policy of the laws themselves. So in order to be effective, these policy standards really need to strike the right balance between credibility and practicality. And with that, I will conclude. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we're going to go right on to question and answer, and I'm going to see if I can get Brian to go ahead and unmute all the presenters. So that would be Bill, Ellen, Tom, and Tim. And I'm going to just go throw a few questions out. Thanks to everyone for sending your questions. I printed off a bunch of them. I did an unenvironmental thing and printed them off. I'm sorry. But I wanted to go right to Ellen. We had a question from Mike Hennikin. And this question, Ellen, perhaps you saw it on there, but I'll just repeat it. Should we have any faith whatsoever in the IPCC report? Almost daily there are scientific papers published to completely refute most of the basic tenets of the report. If the report is flawed and CO2 is not really a problem, then all these treaties, regulations, policies are worthless and will not affect the problem that perhaps doesn't exist. So Ellen, I'm wondering if you could comment and maybe give a bit of a response. And if anyone else wants to pipe in after Ellen, please do. Please try to keep your response to about 20 or 30 seconds so we can get as many questions as we can.
Right. Well, my response would be, I'm not sure what literature this individual, I've forgotten who put this up here, but I mean, indeed, we do get new science virtually every day. Science is not 100%. It's not perfect. The IPCC puts forth the best science that is available at that time. There have been 4 assessments. With every assessment, new knowledge is incorporated, models are refined. I don't know what scientific literature this person is referring to specifically, so it would be impossible to refute, or to counter this person's statement without knowing, A, what was the topic, B, who was the author or who were the authors, and C, where was it published. Frankly, we all know that there is a very, very active disinformation campaign that is well funded, and I just received on my desk in the last week a very large, glossy, non-governmental panel on climate change that attempts to refute the entire IPCC. Not peer-reviewed. You look at the people who are the key authors. It's the Idsos and Fred Singer. And then the editors virtually are people who are not deeply engaged in climate science. That's my response.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. Tom, did you want to add anything on that?
Well, there are skeptics and contrarians, that do include some scholars. Ellen mentioned Fred Singer. He's one of the best known. I think sometimes some of the skeptics and contrarians, I think they actually serve a good purpose in the sense that they make us look deeply into things. They make us rethink things. I personally believe from the literature I've read that CO2 increases are currently causing temperature increases. From the literature I read, and so forth. My conclusion is that, in fact, CO2 is causing global climate change, specifically causing global warming. But sometimes some of the science, I think, has improved as a result of some of the questions skeptics and contrarians make. But my conclusion is, from the data and from the studies, is that higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are contributing to global warming. And I think those concentrations are going to go up. And I think that's going to cause a warmer planet.
Great. Hey, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I want to jump on. There's a couple other questions here from Hans and a few others that were sort of along the same rules. So I'm going to throw this out to Tim and also to Bill to maybe jump in there. But basically, it's this question from Hans Rosbrock about the Economist and the Times had articles saying, Japan and Germany aren't following the Kyoto Protocol. How do we enforce the rules? And there was some further discussion down about, how do we do some enforcement of the rules for energy companies? And of course, this also exists maybe for forestry offsets or land-based offsets. So maybe Tim, if you might have a thought on that, and then Bill, you can jump in after that.
Sure. I think this is a critical question. I think it's a critical question for any international agreement. And this is just me speaking personally. I think in order for any international agreement to be effective, the U.S. has to be a leader in it. And the only way for the U.S. to really be a leader here is if the U.S. decides to put policy in place, they have to make it effective in the United States. The problem as Bill put it, one of the potential good things about carbon dioxide is it is a global pollution. No matter what we do and where we do it, it affects everyone. So if everyone's not on board, we're not going to be able to do this. So how can the U.S. affect things individually? Well, through a cap-and-trade type policy or a carbon tax type policy. If they can make it effective in the U.S., it will have global benefits, and they'll show that one of the nations, one of the world's top is willing to make some changes and affect the global concentrations of carbon dioxide. In order to do that, I think Brent brought this up, and it was something I was going to bring up, but he brought it up because I didn't talk much about it. One of the things that really has to be put in place here is some sort of border tax adjustments or border pricing. If a policy like this is going to be effective, as an economist, I know what some of the pitfalls are with those types of those policies. But if the U.S. is going to be a price leader in pricing carbon, that price has to be able to be passed through to other countries. And so on imports and exports, particularly imports, it has to be the case that if the U.S. prices carbon, that the price of imports also has to reflect that price of carbon in order for it to be effective. I think if the U.S. were successful in doing that, that price would be passed through to at least part of the world, and then it would be at least a start in getting global agreement.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Bill to follow up. But before, Tim, did I just hear you say that you agree with border tax adjustments?
I don't necessarily agree with them, but I think if we're going to have a U.S.-based policy, if the U.S. then decides to be a leader on this, and we put a policy in place, it is going to raise the price of carbon-intensive products in the United States in order to have that price be passed through to other countries. I don't see other way other than through international agreement for border tax adjustment.
Great, Tim. Thanks. Hey, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I would start just by saying, within this country, I think we have a lot of control. I think the question was, if I understood it, around, what if a country didn't adhere to their commitments under the UN agreement? What can be done? And I think it's a really tough question. Within this country, if we develop a cap-and-trade system, I think we could have fines or other things for people who are in non-compliance for companies that didn't meet their goals. But internationally, if you look at international treaties, I'm not an expert in it, but what I understand is it's generally kind of a moral arguments and embarrassment that are the ramifications if you don't meet the goals of agreement. I think it's a very good question. I think maybe Tim may have been trying to get at a little bit about with the U.S. as a leader. If the U.S. Doesn't come to the table, I think you're going to see a lot of more companies, or countries rather, not really meeting their commitments. I think it's pretty easy to back out of them if the largest emitter, or right there with China anyway, isn't even a part of the treaty. So I think we have to lead really in this, and passing U.S. legislation is a good way to be a leader in that.
Great. Hey, thanks, Bill. Just to note, everyone, we've got about 3 minutes left. We're going to get a few more questions in here. I did want to make sure to remind everyone, Brian just put up there a point that we would very much appreciate folks going to the evaluation form and filling that out at the end. It should take about 3 to 4 minutes of your time. Of course, we're going to be putting on more of these webinars down the road, so your ideas on topics would be very, very helpful. Okay, so going on, I'd like to throw out another question actually to Bill. There were quite a few questions about these sort of land-based offsets. One from Joe Bonnell seemed to catch some of what other people were saying as well. And who's going to monitor these offset credits? And that's really thinking of in Ohio here. I know we just sort of talked internationally, but could you bring it back to Ohio? How are we going to do this in Ohio, and who's going to monitor here? And also, there was a question by Jim Skeels. What's the current price? Do you have a sense of what that current price is?
Okay. Yeah, and who's going to monitor this? I think that's an outstanding question. It's a good question, but it's also one that we don't know the answer to yet. I think that's going to depend on the regulations, but I can tell you kind of my theory on what I think the regulations would likely call for. I think it would likely call for some type of third-party. We're looking at a project approach, and you're probably looking at a third-party verification of the methods that are described by the USDA as needing to be put into place. And who will actually do the measurement on the ground? I think it could be, it could be a new industry. Even there's folks in Ohio, Windrock International, for example, who's doing that kind of work already, both in Ohio and in other places. I think it could be that it's possible you could get academic institutions even involved in monitoring. But I think what's going to happen is that in the end you'll have a third-party verification process by certifiers that are accredited by the U.S. government. That's my guess about the way that would happen. On the price per ton, right now that's an interesting question. The Chicago Climate Exchange is the one that may be most relevant as a market in terms of people being able to play in the market right now. And those tons, last time I saw, I think they're around $4 or $5 a ton of CO2. Internationally, you could get potentially prices in the $15 to $20 range, and for ourselves in the Nature Conservancy, kind of the small voluntary markets, we're charging $20 a ton for projects that we're putting out there, but the volumes are quite small. So it depends on the market. My guess is that once you have a regulatory market, if the land-based offsets kind of are given the same credence and credit as other offset types, as I mentioned in the presentation, that's what I've heard is somewhere in the $15 to $30 range. So 20 may be a good guess of where we might end up more or less.
Great. Hey, thanks, Bill. Okay, so we're basically at the end of our time here, folks. I do want to do one other thing. I want to go through all of our speakers and give them one last chance they've seen some of the questions that have come across the chat. Maybe we didn't hit something in our discussion here. I want to give each of them in order. We'll just go down in order, Ellen to Tom to myself, and then to Tim, and finally to Bill. Just about another 20 seconds. Is there anything else you'd like to just sort of throw out there in response to some of the questions you saw? So, Ellen.
No, I really didn't. The only comment I would make is that, as scientists, it's our role to be skeptics. And so, all scientists should be skeptical, and we work by the scientific method, which means that we continuously work to disprove our hypotheses. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ellen. We really appreciate that. Tom.
Oh, okay. Well, it's been a pleasure being here. I did have a question from Jim Jasinski, and I just typed an answer in there. He asked about walleye and perch in the lake. A 2 degree Fahrenheit temperature increase in Lake Erie would not necessarily be a large threat to walleye and perch, but there's this issue of dead zones in Lake Erie. Didn't have a chance to talk about that, but those occur from time to time. Could be more common with global climate change, and those would be a threat to walleye especially. But it's been a pleasure being here, and if anybody has any questions for me, you can email me, you can call me, it's on the slides, and if you'd like me to come out and talk to your group or community, I'd be happy to do so. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Let's go with Tim, and then we'll go to Bill. Maybe Tim already went off the line.
Sorry, I had pushed the mute button. I was talking without anybody hearing me. There was a question thrown out about whether Ohio should pay the burden of the tax or the burden of carbon pricing because they're one of the biggest emitters. I like to separate those the issue of who pays from the issue of emissions. To me, it's more of a subjective judgment of who pays. Sure, there's always the polluter pays principle, but the question of efficiency, what's the cheapest way to reduce emissions moving forward, it may not be the case that the biggest polluters end up reducing the most, because if those are the highest cost polluters, we'd end up with a really costly solution. So we have to be careful in thinking about the cost of the policy as well as sort of the moral considerations or ethical considerations.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Bill, any last words?
Yeah, I'd just say thanks again, and there was at least one comment here, question that I didn't get to answer. I just asked if people have any other questions for me. My email is bstanley@tmc.org, so look forward to hearing from you, and thanks again, Brent.
No problem. Thanks to everybody. Just a couple questions I wanted to answer real quick. Stacy Brannon, why is the initial cap so far away? Waxman-Markey, actually, I just didn't put it up there. They did have a 2012 cap of 3%, so they were thinking of a near-term goal. And so that one, there's a few other questions on there we probably won't get to. Apologize, but for sure, feel free to email. Brian's putting up the email addresses for all of the participants. Please go out and fill out our evaluation. That's really going to be helpful for our future webinars. We appreciate all of your time and interest in this subject, and we'll look forward to interacting with you in the future at our future webinars. So thanks a lot, and everyone have a great day.